Hey you guys, Tamika Caston here, and I just wanted to connect with you because we are going to be going inside the Yoga Sutras and investigating about the yamas. Essentially, the yamas are the commitments that a yogi makes in order to act like a yogi. And this is just a part of yoga philosophy. And it is part of it's one of the levels of the 8 limbs of yoga. One of the things that I like about the book that I use to analyze these philosophies and practices is that there's always a suggestion that there's something outside of these practices that we can look to. And this is where we can really incorporate and draw from the learnings that we brought to the table. One of the things one of my teachers says is, don't throw out everything you know when you come into a new practice. And for sure, there's no need to throw out everything you know. You're in this practice because of a reason. You arrived here for a reason. So essentially what ends up happening is the Yoga Sutras are 4 chapters. There are 196 aphorisms on essentially what is yoga and what is it all about. And it's separated in these 4 chapters or padas, and each pada has a particular focus. The second pada's focus is all about practice and what practice looks like. Now, if we were to open Instagram, we would see that practice is, handstands, or practices, arm balances, practices, really pretty poses. But in the Yoga Sutras, that's not what we're talking about. Practices are the practices that help control the vritti, which we, living in an external format, have begun utilizing the external expressions like movement in order to fill inside. Sometimes I refer to this as like cutting almost. So if you think about why people cut, they cut because they're attempting to feel something or express something that is so difficult to express that it can be expressed through pain. Well, I mean, we know that this is something that people do in yoga asana, and that is to feel the burn, and to feel it, to know that something is happening, and to express this internal desire. I mean, once we start actually looking at what yoga actually is, we don't really buy into that anymore. So that brings me back to the sutras and to the practices that we're focusing on for February. And those are called the yamas. And in the yamas, they're essentially the restraints that yogis attempt to do. Now, none of us are like holed up in the Himalayas or anything like that, so we can't expect to be perfect. We're householders. We're not, full-time doing the things all the time. But these are the practices that we can lean into. So I wanted to just essentially just give you an idea of what this pada or chapter is about, which is really like the practices. Some of the things that come up are like how to utilize yoga in order to control or to master the mind, and that's like study, self-study, surrender, and specifically surrender to God, surrender to something that's bigger than yourself, and accepting pain as a part of the process. The second pada goes through suffering, the ways of suffering, which we could talk about at another time. And it also says that all suffering is rooted in ignorance. So, but again, those ways of suffering, that's another topic for another day. This pada introduces the concept of karma and talks about, how karma is essentially the cause of our experiences. Yeah, there's a lot in this. And what I would like to focus on is just the yamas. So first, just an introduction of the yamas is in Yoga Sutra 2.30, and essentially it says yama consists of nonviolence, truthfulness, non-stealing, continence, and non-greed. Now, before all of this, it's important to note that there were 29 other things that were discussed that are talking about, or rather 26 other things that were discussed previous to this. Yoga Sutra 2.28 introduces a practice of the 8 limbs of yoga. And 2.29, the 2 being the second pada, 2.9 being the 29th aphorism, introduces what those 8 limbs of yoga are. And then the next one is, of course, what the yamas are, because that's the first limb of yoga. So the first limb of yoga the first yama is ahimsa. And many of us know ahimsa very well because we have people talking about it a lot. People utilize the concept of ahimsa to either justify or encourage people to become vegan, because this concept is all about non-violence. One of the things that I find interesting about focusing on not eating a particular, option as ahimsa is it becomes, again, kind of an external focus. And I wonder if people are actually utilizing ahimsa in making these suggestions for people whose history with food is unknown. But I will say is that ahimsa is non-violence. Notice that it is non-violence. It's not peace. So remember, these are restraints. So they're written from a negative. So the is the non, and the himsa is the violence or the harming. And non-violence is the supreme among all the yamas, and it is never to be violated. It is to be applied to humans, to animals, and to inanimate objects, because in this concept, everything is a part of creation. Everything has purpose. So, wow, like, what does that mean? So that's a point to get really curious about. We could give a really easy answer and say, okay, I'm not going to eat anything that was ever living. And I can tell you, as a farmer, to produce broccolini, for example, which I have currently growing, I have to kill a lot of aphids. So there's something always harmed in the process of food. Or if, it doesn't matter if it's plants, it doesn't matter if it is anything, they're going to be harmed. So that's one thing to consider, is like, how can we dig deep into non-harming if we thought that veganism was the way? How can we use something beyond food to consider harm in the world? How are we talking to other people? How are we allowing other people to talk to us? Does ahimsa look like having boundaries? In my opinion, that's a yes. Are boundaries too thick? Are they walls? Are they too porous? Are they too flexible? So again, this is something to just get curious about, and we can discuss. I would like to further discuss this with you guys. In this book that I'm reading on the Yoga Sutras, which I teach from for my own teacher training, one of the things that I find is interesting is that they say violence is a reaction to fear, a key symptom of the dominance that egoism and ignorance have over the mind. Violence is not defined by any particular destructive act, but by the desire to see another harmed. That's why nonviolence includes refraining from harm in thought as well as in word and deed. To avoid doing harm while harboring hateful or spiteful thoughts does not satisfy the spirit of Ahimsa. What's interesting about that is, for me, growing up in the Christian tradition, for sure this sounds like something that I've read before, like murder is hating a person in your heart has always been something that I remember being raised with. So it's really interesting to me about the study of the sutras as another tradition is that we see that people have essentially had the same questions in every part of the world for a very long time. And there's no one particular group that was thinking about it. Everyone was thinking about these same life questions. And some groups wrote the thought of what those answers were down, and others did not. And others were conquered with those words. So that is one interesting bit about Ahimsa. So my ask of you this week is to get really curious about, what does Ahimsa look like toward yourself? What does it look like toward others? And what does it look like in general toward animals and towards inanimate objects? And what does that even look like? And we'll discuss. Definitely journal it out, and also consider what that looks like in your yoga practice this week, your yoga asana and meditation practice. We're also focusing on Satya, which is truthfulness. I like to think of this also as truth speaking, and I like to liken this to Don Miguel Ruiz's The Four Agreements: be impeccable with your words. And of course, in other traditions, being honest and being truthful is a part of leaning into those traditions and being a good fill in the blank with your, preferred religion. So, when we're thinking about truthfulness, however, one of the easy things to think about is just like saying the truth to other people. But again, I bring this back to ourselves. How are we speaking non-truths to ourselves, which also cause harm? So remember that Ahimsa is the primary yama, and that's because a lot of the subsequent ones end up actually causing harm. And then how do you speak truth? Let's say that truth hurts, How do you speak truth without it being harm? So one of the things that we can really look at this week is truth speaking when it comes to being a stand for justice. There are a lot of people out there, myself included, who would say that yoga is justice. Yoga is social justice. If you're not doing social justice, you are spiritually bypassing as a yogi. And that's a very, specific stand. And that is my truth. So if we're speaking truth and we're being mindful of Ahimsa, then that may not be something that another person interprets as kind or as nice, but it's truth. I had this happen just this weekend where I had a disagreement with a family member, and the family member was saying, I'm not listening. And I said, I am listening. I just don't agree. And I'm not going to tell you that I agree when I don't agree, because that's not the truth. I do not believe what you're saying is truthful for me, and I'm not going to lie about it to spare your feelings. It's hard, right? And one of the things that Dr. Gail Parker says is, who wrote the book, Restorative Yoga and Stress and Race-Based Trauma, said that you're either going to be right or you're going to be in relationship. And part of the things are are just part of what I think of being a truth speaker is acknowledging that not everyone's going to like the truth that you speak, and it's okay. I also don't know that truth speaking is about convincing other people. For me, this looks like if someone were to tell me that my sofa were red, I'm not going to argue with that person. I'm going to say the sofa is blue and move on. So it's curious to me when truth speaking looks like arguing, right? It's like, I'm not going to argue with you. This is what truth looks like from my understanding of fill in the blank. And I'm not going to argue with you about it. I'm not trying to change your mind, and I'm not trying to convince you. I am just speaking my truth. And in this, of course, it's important to consider how truth has arrived in our minds. Like, are we speaking truth from a clean slate, from a clean mirror? Are we speaking truth from a dirty lens? A thing to consider this week in your yoga asana meditation practice is when difficult poses or situations arise, how do I speak untruths to myself? For example, I'm not good enough, or I'm just not that flexible, or I'm not strong, or man, COVID really messed me up, or which COVID messing you're like, what does that mean? Be impeccable with your words. Is it that you actually have physical damage to your lungs, and so your lung capacity is different? Or are you saying that somehow a quarantine interrupted your daily yoga practice because your daily yoga practice depended on you being in a studio and your studio closed? So the question then becomes, is it really that COVID interrupted your yoga practice, or was your yoga practice not your practice? Your practice was a communal, energetic exchange that included yoga as a part of it. Because if it were your daily practice would continue whether or not it was in studio. Again, this may not be a popular opinion, but this is just something that for me resonates as truth. And I do understand that they may not resonate as truth as for others. And I'm not trying to change anyone's mind, just giving you an example that may or may not resonate. So today, when you're looking into truthfulness, or this week, as you're looking into truthfulness, what does that look like in terms of how you practice it towards others? How are you being truthful, truth speaking? And then how are you doing that with yourself? Like, are you truly being truthful with are you being impeccable with your words? Are you really broken? Are you really weak? Really, 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 really? Are you really, is this really a bad side or a good side? And one of the things that we can consider when we're assessing these things is there an over-identification with a particular layer of the body? So for example, is there an over-identification with the physical body that says, I am weak on my right side, or I am stronger on my right side? That's an over-identification with the physical body. Are you this divine spirit that continues and is not limited to this life and the experience of this life, weak on a side of your body? So again, these are just things to consider when you're saying things, offhand things, because when we say things over and over again, they become mantra, and we don't want for an untruth or mistruth to be a mantra for us or affirmation. Imagine how many times we affirm horrible things about ourselves or others. So just get really curious about that and journal. Satya might be your area to really marinate on, or maybe it is Ahimsa. Those are our two focuses for this week. because last week we had a real soft opening. All right, now we will connect again. Talk to you soon. Take care of yourselves and others. Bye-bye.